Well, good morning, sand trackers and barefooters. So we're a little bit late today, but today it's Tuesday morning live. I'm Jono Break, and today we're going to be talking about revenue streams and cost structures in your business. And so these are the last two elements in the business model canvas we've been talking about for the last 3 or 4 weeks. And we've been talking about your customers, and we've talked about the key aspects of your business. But this is now, it runs across the bottom if you look at it as a visual, and these are the considerations in terms of the financial considerations of the business, okay? So this is probably one of the areas where maybe I'm least qualified to talk about, but at the same time, as someone who isn't, massively numbers minded, these are fundamentals that over the years I've had to learn in business, and no doubt, whether you like your numbers or not, you need to learn them too. And so let's talk through some of those things and what they mean, and we'll go from there. Okay, so any questions you have as we go along, please feel free to ask, or come back if you're watching this video later, leave some messages and we'll answer those questions for you. So anyway, let's get into it. So we're going to look at costs first, okay? So pretty simple in business, right? There's money coming in and there's money going out, all right? And so these are just, it's just very, very simple. But it's not just simply money coming in and money going out. And a lot of the time when we're looking at, for example, the cost structuring of our business, and all the different aspects in terms of the dollar considerations, the numerical side of the business, we often structure it in terms of a snapshot. All right, so even just the planning we do. So we look at maybe a profit and loss, like a balance sheet, but at the same time, there's also that, the challenge then that's just a snapshot in time. All right. So one of the things I learned very quickly in business was the difference between my profit and my cash flow. Okay. You need to understand this. So it's not just the fact, can I project that I'm getting this money in and that money's going out? So am I getting that revenue and is there that cost? It's more about the timing of when each of those elements happen. And so even in one of our businesses, we started to develop a weekly cash flow statement. We worked with our bank, we had some tight numbers in terms of when typically clients paid and when we paid our staff and so forth, because at the end of the day, your business is a hungry beast, whether you like it or not. And so it's going to consume resources even when you're sitting idle. And anyone in COVID who's had to shut down will testify to that. There's rents, there's electricity, there's maybe some furloughed staff costs, maybe there's other things going on, bank interest, there might be other payments you have to make, rent, loans. So let's first of all talk about what some of the main costs might be. And so some of them are, so it's understanding where your cost situations sit, all right? So we look at, the two basic ones are fixed and variable costs. So the fixed costs are costs that recur no matter what, okay? So rent is a good example of that. Now, even with these fixed costs, we can look at how our fixed costs get reduced or how they get managed. But fixed costs tend to be something I have to pay every week. If I have 5 people working for me, they're going to want to be paid every week. If I have to pay rent, I have to pay loans, I have to maybe pay a supplier for something. So these might be fixed costs that are ongoing. Variable costs, now, interesting enough, everyone I just mentioned could also become a variable cost, right? Probably be rent, things like that. That's not going to change too often because you usually go into a long-term agreement. But a variable cost is something that changes over time. So, for example, if you have a load of contractors, okay, well, that's going to be more of a variable cost. So contractors working for you, I should say. So they're going to be a variable cost because you're only paying them based on the work that you're asking them to deliver on. So if they're not working, you're not paying them. Another variable cost may be some of your input costs in terms of, for example, electricity. Although it has to be paid every month, it might vary based on your consumption. Other variable costs will be things like, just the cost of doing business, the cost of supply, all those sorts of things. And so these are things that we can manipulate very quickly and really, get a grip on in terms of looking at our own sense of cash flow and profit and loss. Fixed costs tend to be obviously they're very predictable. We know when they're going to come in and go out, so we can plan them better in terms of our cash flow. Variable costs may be a little bit more unpredictable, not necessarily completely, but certainly once you get into a rhythm of delivering your business, then you'll be able to see how your variable cost lands. For example, how often do I have to pay staff, or how often do I have to work with suppliers and all that sort of thing, or do contractors get paid at a certain time of the month? I work with a contracting company, and they pay in the middle of the month every month, and so I know that there's certain things that have to happen there, and as do they. So, a couple of things to consider here. So, what are the most important costs that are inherent to our business? Okay, there's the first fundamental question. All right, so if I'm a manufacturer, I'm going to have some big capital costs. I'm going to have some supply costs. I'm going to have some production costs. I'm going to have some logistics costs. If I'm in IT, I'm going to have maybe developers, coders, deliverers, testers, all those sorts of things. And then there's going to be costs in terms of how I market and advertise my business, how I promote what I do. We also use the cost structure here to figure out what resources are going to be the most expensive, particularly if we're starting to look at, do we need investment or not? Having a good grip on these things and knowing, are these, what resources are going to cost me the most? How do I actually factor those in so that we've got them properly organized? And also what activities do I do? Not just the resources. So I might have an input supply that's incredibly expensive, but it's a small per unit or whatever. But also the key activities that I do. Okay. So again, if I'm a production facility, then my biggest costs are going to be my machinery and my staff. If I'm a code factory, for example, my biggest cost is actually my people. Okay. It's not necessarily my machinery. So we even in the industry, we call it human capital, because there's a way of looking at it in terms of how people cost. And so, my last business that I had staff in was a graphic design, a branding agency. And so, people were by far and away our biggest cost. Software, rent, all those sorts of things were quite inconsequential in comparison. And and they were our fixed costs. They were our ongoing costs. That was the only, the leverages we had on those were fairly limited. So it's understanding what activities and what resources are the most expensive in my plan. Okay. And is there a way to limit those? Because obviously as we start to look at those and analyze those, can we actually drive them down? Can we look at a better cost of production? Can we look at different suppliers? Can we get suppliers negotiating off each other? So a couple of things to consider here is, the first thing is to determine the economy of scale, okay? So as I scale my business, my cost of production per unit, per person should reduce, okay? That's a fairly standard thing. So economies of scale are harder in a startup because obviously you're scaling, but it should be something that you strive towards. And this is where particularly when we look in larger businesses, when we look in manufacturing, logistics, we start talking about lean processes, agile processes, agile systems, these sorts of things, which help us drive a greater efficiency in our business. And obviously driving the per unit cost down. As we're driving the per unit cost down of input, if we're staying at the same revenue, hopefully we're driving a higher profitability, a higher net and gross profit on our product. So there's certain things to consider, and they'll all play into these cost structures. So for example, we're producing something now that is a smaller run. So I'm working with a company at the moment. We're looking at producing 100,000 bottles of a product. Okay. Now my goal would be to get that client to 1 million bottles of product. So certainly the bottle supplier, the cost per unit for the bottle, at 100,000 might be this, at 1 million it might be that, okay? Because obviously they're doing a large run, it's all automated, they haven't got people, so they're doing their own economies of scale. And so when you look at, as we scale the business, some of our costs, our input costs go down, some of our supply costs, but that will also require either greater automation, which is more of a capital cost, or it's going to require more people, okay, which is also another input cost. So thinking about those things as you go along, as you scale. So look at your business in terms of different scenarios. If I'm producing at 100,000 units a week versus 1 million units a week, or 5 units a week versus 100 units a week, what are my costs of input, and and that's all going to play into then, which will be the next piece in a minute. We'll talk about it's a revenue, which plays into the revenue stream, because obviously you've got to be making enough money to cover your costs and make a profit. So is your business more cost driven? You know, is it the leanest cost structure possible? Are we looking at low price value proposition, maximum automation, extensive outsourcing? Are we looking at all these sorts of things? So have a think through some of those. Or is it more value driven? Okay, which means your cost of production actually might be a little bit higher. You know, I've been in some places, for example, a place near where I live that, or I haven't been in there, but I've seen where they make shoes that cost quite a few $100s a pair, but that means they can also make them more boutique. If you look at I think it's Lamborghini, one of those high-end car manufacturers where everything's made by hand, or most stuff is made by hand sewn, hand painted, hand delivered. And so there's that uniqueness which you look at it and go, well, that's, for a car manufacturer, that's crazy. But at the same time, when you look at the price of the vehicle, they're making a lot of money out of that and doing quite fine. Thank you very much. So thinking about what you're delivering in terms of your costs. So are you going to be cost driven, or are you going to be value driven? We talked about that too in the key assets, key resources, and we also talked about it in the customer. What does the customer want? So if you're going to be more cost driven, then it's going to imply, I mean, obviously we're always looking for ways to improve on costs, all right? But it's also going to imply that if that's my priority, it's going to imply that you're going to a larger market with a lower cost product. And so there's all that to consider as well. So we look at things like fixed and variable costs. We look at economies of scale. Economies of scope is another one to think about here. And that is, if I have a couple of products, so for example, I've got a client that they have one base formula for a pharmaceutical product they sell, but they then break it up into 4 or 5 different resources, 4 or 5 different consumable products. And in fact, there's probably another 6 or 7. So we now start to look at economies of scope. I can make the one formula, I can make the one liquid, and I can maybe do a minor tweak which costs me nothing or very little, and I can change the whole factor. You know, in this case, it could go from humans, also, for example, from humans to surfaces to animals, okay, with different regulations and different processes, some more expensive than others. So these are all things to consider. What are my economies of scope? Can I take this one product and divide it? Now, we've got to be very careful here because we don't want to be dividing our market either. All right, so this might require different brands. This might be a down the track thinking, but this is part of your planning process, remember, so we're putting this all together. All right, in the interest of time, so once you've established your business model, whether it's cost or value driven, you've got to then consider your key resources and activities and what you've put together there. And always remember matching your value to what your customer is expecting from you, okay? So we're coming back right through the business model canvas. If you want a really good business model canvas, Linda has actually written a great book. And to get access to that, you need to be a paid member of the Sandtrax Club, which we welcome you to do. I think it's $97 for a quarter. It's not expensive to get access to us, to get access to these resources, and to get access to some incredible mentors as well. And we've already got people, we've got people joining up to that and enjoying the benefits of that. So please come and join us and be part of that. And you can get access to a really good detailed questioning around this, and obviously us to talk through it as well in a more detailed. But just think about your value proposition in terms of your costs, okay? So we're now going to jump to revenue, which is the other piece. So we're now talking about money in, money out. All right. So we're now talking about money in. Now this is a hard lesson I learned in business, right? Just because I can project that I'm going to get money in doesn't mean my business is going to be successful. And I'll explain why in a minute. All right. So remember, revenue is a primary indicator of success in your business. Now, it's a primary indicator, okay? Am I making money? And so that's a pretty good one, but it's not the only indicator, right? Because we've got to factor in profitability. We've also got to factor in cash flow. So there's going to be a way I generate this revenue and how I pull that together that's going to be really, really important. So revenue on its own is not an indicator of success. I learned this lesson the hard way, and I'm sure most of you sitting there going, well, duh. But at the end of the day, revenue is not the only indicator of success. There is a way that a business generates revenue that predicts its success, okay? And this is where we learn the difference between profitability and cash flow, okay? And we also think about business life cycles. So we've got product life cycles. We've got, the the thing we're selling, the service, the product, goes through a cycle where you have an increase, and then you get to a point and either other entrants or people just get bored of the product or whatever it might be. And so what happens is your profitability and your sales start to decline. And so you've either got to reinvent yourself and start on a new product cycle or life cycle, or you decline and die, okay? Or you become, I think about some of the big surf brands, for example, that were in Australia when I was a kid, like Mambo or some of those that were high-end surf brands at the time. And today, you find them in Kmart. So there's obviously, and that's been a fundamental shift. And there's brands that go in the other direction as well. Sadly, during the coronavirus, the company's failed, but Virgin Blue became Virgin Australia and started a transition towards becoming a full-service airline, and did it fairly well. I think then they became a victim of their own cost structures as well, but the actual brand transition worked, and who knows what they're going to end up looking like under their new owners. So there's things to think about. What are the life cycles? What's going on in the market? How do I manage those things? When considering your revenue streams, we always consider cash flow, okay? For example, I work with a lot of project-based companies, and I'm staggered at how many you say, okay, are you taking a 30% upfront from the client? No. So a lot of projects are just like a launch of a rocket, right? 80% of the fuel of a rocket, well, at least it used to be, certainly like the space shuttle, stuff like that, 80% of the fuel is expended getting that rocket into orbit. Once they're in orbit, it's almost job done. They can stay there for a week, weeks, whatever, certainly a long time, and consume the rest of the fuel and obviously the fuel to land. And so this is similar in business. We expend a lot of energy launching and getting going and winning customers and all that sort of thing. We spend a ton of resources on this. So we've got to think about the cost of doing these things. And then how are we going to gather revenue in? And so it's the same thing in a revenue generation, right? So in a project, I always say, grab a chunk of money up front, because your costs are going to be high up front. You're doing a lot of discovery. You're getting to know the client. You're spending a lot of time with them. So you're actually burning hours. And if you've got other people involved, they don't care if you haven't got the money in from the client yet. They just care that they get paid. And so hopefully they care about your business, but they really want to get paid. And so these costs start to escalate early on. You might have to do buy something from a supplier, and they want a guarantee, like a cost up front, something up front before delivery. So think about these things. Think about how you're gathering your revenue, and make sure you're getting percentages as much as you can up front, and gathering what you can. Now, be careful not to grab all of it up front, because you as the provider can get lazy if all of a sudden the money's not there at the end and you've got to move on to the next money generating thing. So make sure you keep it compartmentalized, and this is why understanding your revenue streams and how your cash flow works becomes really important, so that you don't I've seen this happen with businesses where they have to shift onto another client and get their income in to be able to pay for the previous client to finish their job. That's bad business, and we need to be way more careful with our cash flow. So this is why cash flow becomes important. The other side of it too is if you run out of cash. So for example, if you are producing something for a client and you're relying on a supplier and you haven't got that cash anymore, right? The supplier won't give you the product. Guess what? You're going to start to look bad in front of the client, because either the supplier will relegate you to a low value customer, and therefore they'll produce an inferior product, which is then passed on to your customer, or they just won't supply at all, okay, unless you provide some guarantees. All right, so we had to deal with this a little bit back in my branding agency, where we did start to run into supply issues. We were a little overcapitalized, and so we came up with some creative ways of doing that. One in particular was, and this is in the design space, where we had printers, obviously printing output products, brochures, stationery, whatever, business cards. And so one of the things we did was we went to each of the suppliers and we said, look, we spoke to our major customers who were the major cost inputs, and we went to the supplier and said, look, we're going to get you to invoice the customer directly. We've already talked to the customer's fine. And then you pay us a percentage, which we actually then took off the cost of their next product that they supplied. And so we were able to eat through the challenges we had with them within months. And so just you can get creative in the way you do these things. So there are ways to think about and how you actually manage your revenue. Revenue collection also needs to be strategized, okay? Particularly when you're on your own, this is one of the big challenges for businesses, is collecting revenue, okay? Because you're often delivering to a client, you like the person, you're friends with them, maybe you've got a good rapport with them, so asking them for money is a challenge. So get those money fights out of the way early in the relationship. Make sure you're clear that, you know, that I will be collecting the revenue, this is when it's going to be, this is what it's going to be based on. Be very clear on benchmarks and deliverables, so there's no questions, there's no, you know, quibbling over who did what and who's supplying what. And don't be afraid to ask, okay? It's nothing rude about asking your customer for money, all right? So if you're in, you know, in different revenue streams where, for example, it might be a subscription like here at Sandtrax, or it might be a recurring model where, you know, maybe you set up direct debit arrangements out of credit cards or debit cards. Maybe you have a way of collecting revenue, so if they don't pay, you cut them off so they're not consuming your resources. So there's different ways of thinking about that and how you actually cash flow that as a resource. So revenue collection needs to be strategized. It needs to be put into your plan. How am I going to collect the revenue? In what stages? What's the flow? What's the process? And how do I do that well? Because at some point in time too, you're going to have someone that's managing all of that for you, be it a bookkeeper, a financial advisor, a chief financial officer, an outsourced firm, whatever. And so having those processes in place just makes it really easy for them to do it too. And it makes it easy if you ever have, you know, if a debt goes delinquent and you have to chase it up in the courts as well. So put all those things in place and will help you manage your cash flow. So thinking about some of the revenue streams. So what is the value our customers paying for? So I could produce 2 widgets that are exactly the same and potentially charge wildly different prices for them. In fact, we see this a lot, particularly in white labeled goods, where and you see this in supermarkets, for example, in brand, you know, when the supermarket has its own brand. And so often they're using the same supplier as the name brands, but because they've got a deal struck and they've got different cost structures, they're able to drop the price in terms of the product out. Aldi is a really great example if you have an Aldi supermarket in your area. So, for example, some of their cereal products, I mean, remember in Australia, their Wheat Bix was exactly the same. I was looking at it, like even the packaging looks similar, and a buddy of mine at Aldi saying, oh yeah, we just get them made by Sanitarium. And so it's exactly the same product at the end of the day. And so think about that. So what is the customer willing to pay? So they're willing to pay less for a box of Weet-Bix at Aldi than maybe at another supermarket, at a brand name, at an Ingles or a Woolworths or whatever it might be. And so what do they currently pay? How would they prefer to pay? Okay, so you know, I've found that customers become less and less resistant to just regular recurring payments online, particularly with a lot of securities in place. And so thinking about those sorts of things, you know, am I collecting something from a customer regularly? You'll see particularly a lot of software and licensing spaces where they might say, look, it's $9.99 a month, but if you pay for 12 months, it's going to be $80 or $79.99, which means effectively getting 2 or 3 months free. But they're getting that revenue from you up front, which is a good cash injection for them. And then their cost of delivery, they've already factored that in anyway, and they know that at $79.99 they're still making money out of you. So thinking about some of those, and we do a quarterly subscription rather than a monthly, and so just thinking about those sorts of things, you know, so that also means I'm not having to process payments all the time. I haven't got the credit card fees. And all the different transaction fees. So there's different things in terms of the way you collect the revenue, but also the ease for the customer. Make it easy to collect revenue. really make it easy. And you know, if you're online, obviously the click-through screens and all those sorts of things, make sure you're making that simple. But this is all about revenue collection. How does each revenue stream contribute to the overall revenue? So again, we look at different businesses that have different revenue structures in the way they do things. And so they have different cost structurings. For example, I've got a plane flying overhead right now. Airlines, particularly discount airlines, make more money out of bags, people wanting to do ticketing online or ticketing face-to-face, and seat selections than they do out of the, you know, that's why, you know, if you've ever flown Ryanair or EasyJet or any of those in Europe, or Allegiant and Spirit here in America, you know, a $15 airfare can turn out to be a $100 airfare very, very quickly because they'll charge you $60 for the bag. And so and often $20 to carry a bag on the plane with you. So everything's drilled down to a cost per unit basis because that's the model they run on. And you'll hear they're the most complaints, but at the end of the day, they make that very clear as to what it is and how you abide by the rules. And so these are all the things you think about in terms of how I generate my revenue, right? So if I generate my revenue based on when somebody actually consumes it, like an airline, then if they buy a ticket way out in advance and I haven't got their bag fee or anything like that, that's going to present some problems to me if they don't fly, okay? So yes, I've got the money for their ticket, but their ticket's not paying for the fuel, not even paying for the people on the plane to fly it. So maybe. And so thinking about those structures, those cost structures, but how your revenue then plays into that, okay? So as we know, there are two types of revenue. There's transactional revenues. Okay, so that's just I buy a product, I go to a shop, I buy a hamburger, I eat the hamburger, I go home. Okay, so I pay for that hamburger. The recurring revenues are ongoing, subscriptions, rentals, annual revenues, whatever it might be. And so we think about things like physical products. We look at ongoings being per hour, per week, per month. But they can also be one-offs as well. So it might be a project fee, for example. Subscriptions, so we got constant access, constantly have money going out. Here's a little trick too with subscriptions too. Set them up in a way that you don't have to ask them for the money every month. So many people set it up so that they do. Set it up the other way around so that it's on the onus of the customer to leave or to cancel, not for you to ask. Okay, just a good little tip there. Renting, leasing, licensing, all these different things. There might be brokerage fees. There might be advertising fees. We actually made money out of advertising we placed for our clients, for example. We acted as a broker for printers for our clients, all those sorts of things. And then there's retainers as well. The sun's just coming over the rise here, so excuse my glowing noggin here. But so we look at these things. We also look at what fixed pricing we have. List prices, product feature development, all those sorts of things. Are they customer segment development? Are they customer segment dependent? Are they volume dependent? All those sorts of things. And how do we generate those revenues? So there's also dynamic pricing to consider. So there is negotiating. So I don't know about you guys, but I do a lot of stuff on contract, and I'd say most of the contracts that when I submit a proposal, there's generally a negotiation that takes place. So my fees aren't hard and fast. However, you look at something like Sandtrax, our fees are hard and fast, okay, and very well priced. If I haven't told you that already today, but it's understanding. Do I have to negotiate on price, because that means I'm going to take some time to do that, or somebody is, and they've got to be paid for as well. That time matters. That time has a dollar value. So we look at dynamic pricing, negotiating, we look at yield management, we look at real time to market, all those sorts of things that all determine the revenue that I make. Okay. So revenue becomes really important. The key message here is make sure you're structuring your revenue strategy so that cash flow is at the forefront, okay? Because you've got to think about, as you grow your business, you're going to need to be able to, sorry, I just got a notification. I thought I'd turn them off. You're going to need to be able to obviously cash flow your growth. You need to be able to think about that structure, when money's coming in, when money's going out, and how I pay for all of that and how I structure that. That's where investors become handy too. It gives you a bit of a capital outlay to create a buffer, give you some sleep at night, or it might be just your own cash flow in some way. I always say customers are the best investors. Make your customer your best investor, and that basically means bring on a customer that's profitable, that really helps you get to where you need to go, and use that as the chance to grow and build your business, develop your IP, but profitably deliver a great service to that customer, so that customer becomes an advocate, and then they start telling other people about you as well, and then you're getting more customers, i.e. more investors on board. So have a think about that in terms of how your revenue comes in. So when mapping out this section of the business model canvas, you've got to think outside of the box, all right? You need to be creative. You need to think about generating revenues and how you do that. Try and be creative. Always try and bring it back to the customer, okay? This is a key message here. The customer is the center of this. That's why we started with the customer first in the canvas. We then moved across to the resources, and now we're down in the revenue in, revenue out, okay? Customers come first. What value are they willing to pay? And what are you willing to pay for the resource to develop that? Okay, so thinking today about the cost of delivering my business, not just a snapshot in time, but an ongoing cash flow. If you're thinking about this in terms of you haven't actually gone into business yet, maybe you lay out a monthly cash flow basis and you can do it week by week. It's not hard to do. Just in a spreadsheet, think about all your input costs, all your output costs, all that sort of thing. So they're things to consider. Inputs, outputs, how they flow together, and that will help you build a successful business from scratch, and also tell you where you need your investment to actually build up the sleep at night capital. All right, if there's nothing else there today, no other questions, it's been wonderful being here this morning. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm Jonathan Brake. As always, enjoy the journey.